forward to engage the piston and pump. Toll the great bell twice. With push of button, fire the engine and spark turbine into life. Toll the great bell thrice. Sing praise to the God of all machines. Omnissiah, bless this work. Stop. Omnissiah, deliver unto my enemies the death and judgment of your creation. Stop. Begin ritual mortification of the flesh. Flesh is weak. The machine is strong. Rituals of repair initiated. The work of creation, the work of the Omnissiah is ours. Apply the blessings of judgment. Apply the blessings of hate. Apply the blessings of resolution. We will persevere. Our enemies will fear the creations of this great machine. Failure is not an option.
Hey there, scabby scummers and gangers. Crimson Oracle here with another episode of Dome Runners TV. Today, we are going to be talking about a topic that is extremely common to run into when you are in the miniatures hobby, when you are engaged in talking about Warhammer and any kind of model building. Inevitably, the conversation is going to turn to 3D printing. And 3D printing is something that I have a lot of experience with. I got my first printer just about 3 years ago, and I have 3 now. I've been doing it extensively. I have printed an extraordinary amount of stuff, and so I feel qualified to talk about it a bit and kind of give you my take on the topic. It's going to be probably a little bit different from a lot of other people's kind of takeaway on this subject. I wouldn't say that I have some unique insight into this, but I do come at it without an agenda. I don't particularly care where people get their models from. I have many lovely 3D printed models that I would, put on any gaming table, and I have seen plenty of beautiful 3D printed models that I think are a fantastic addition to every game that they are made for. So I think that as someone with a lot of experience with this particular technology, I just wanted to do kind of a breakdown of where we're at with 3D printing, what it brings to the table, and the nuance that gets missed along the way people talk about it. So with that, let's jump to the first part of this video. When I say that you've probably heard a lot about 3D printing if you discuss models online or Games Workshop or 40K or any of that stuff, a lot of it takes the form of just a really reductive meme, as you can see here. A lot of people really like to say 3D printer goes burr. And the reason why is complicated. First of all, so obviously this is a reference to a meme that is a whole other can of worms about the Fed printing money for economic stimulus. But that is sort of neither here nor there. It is, in essence, people's way of, sort of taking back some amount of personal ownership of the creative process of making models. And so in that way, I think it comes from a good place. But obviously, this take, it's overly simplistic, right? So people say 3D printer goes burr in response to new model releases or, stuff that they don't want to spend money on necessarily. And I think that that's understandable. I don't think that there's any particular reason that people should have to buy models from a specific company to play any game, really. I don't think that where you get your models from really matters. So I am totally in favor of people finding new sources for models, for designing their own models, for printing their own models. I think these are all fantastic things for the hobby. And we're going to get into all of those different things over the course of this video. But before we get into 3D printing itself, I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of, model making and manufacturing in this hobby, because it's an interesting topic and because it's informative about where we're going. Obviously, we initially, I say we, but this is before I was born even. The companies that we're making models for wargaming hobbyists, pretty much all started with a process that anyone can do, in their home even. They would sculpt the miniatures using some kind of putty, often green stuff. They would cast them in silicone or metal, and they would then spin cast the tin or lead or what have you into the mold, which would then cool and give you a metal model that you could play with. And this process is one that was used for a long time. And there are still companies like Reaper where, they have a large component of their models which are available as these sort of metal models, and they're made much in the same way as models were made back in the 1980s. And what was cool about that is that pretty much anyone can learn how to sculpt, make a master, and then make a mold of it and spin cast. It's not the most complex of challenges when it comes to manufacturing. In fact, it's actually quite straightforward. The only real downside is that you need to deal with hot metal, but that's a relatively minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of things. So while 3D printing is in many ways very revolutionary, and we'll get into why, it's not the first time people have been able to make their own models. Far from it. The model making hobby started with hobbyists mass producing their creations, and that's where a lot of the established players, came from. And so we are in many ways kind of, living in an industry or working from an industry whose initial paradigm was set by hobbyists making models that interest them and selling them to other people who were interested in the same things. So home casting, spin casting, metal casting, this was the start, of a lot of these companies. But it's a very labor intensive, difficult, industry to stay, sort of afloat in. Spin casting metal limits you in a lot of ways in terms of your model designs. And so in time, companies that had the budget for it would invest in having an injection mold made of their models. Now, an injection mold is very different from the very simple silicone mold that the pewter caster or the lead caster would be using. Instead of having, essentially backyard materials, the injection mold is precision engineered to produce models as quickly and cheaply as possible. And as a result, it's expensive. I know that may sound contradictory. You want to make models cheaper, so you have to spend a bunch of money, but that's how it works. It's a intensive technology solution to the problem of how much damn time it takes and how slow it is to make models using spin casting. Injection molds, they take a thermoplastic, they heat it up, they inject it into the mold, they quickly cool it, split open the mold, drop the piece, close it up, and they're ready to go again. You don't have to deal with that sort of, manual process of pulling things apart. You don't have the frequent problem of your silicone tearing and chunks of silicone coming off in your casts and having to redo the mold from the masters and all of that. Injection molding takes all of the extra work that goes into making each individual pewter or lead model and vastly simplifies it to the point where you can produce tens of thousands of kits without any difficulty, without blinking an eye. And let me tell you, injection molding is and likely will remain the dominant way that parts for our models are made. And that is basically just because of physics. If you want to produce a lot of something, then your mold needs to be durable. And an injection mold is steel. Whereas your spin casting mold is generally speaking going to be made out of silicone, which means that it will wear out. It will break down. It will be damaged by the process of casting with it. In the same way, metals and resins are slower to cool than just using a thermoplastic. And because the injection mold is a metal that is encasing a plastic, it can very quickly separate, drop it, close, do a new one. Whereas when you're resin casting, when you're metal casting, you have to be careful. You have to be slow. You can't just rush. And that slow deliberative process, when you have direct labor involved, it adds up. Whereas when you have, that sort of rapid fire speed of an injection mold machine, which doesn't require a person to be sitting there popping things out or pulling things apart, it is significantly cheaper to run than anything in the other sphere. But it comes with the downside that it's enormously expensive. So you need to have enough volume of sales to justify the cost of your molds. So in that way, we wound up with this sort of two-part split in the model making world, where some models are mass produced, they are bought by huge numbers of people, and they are made in plastic. And some models are boutique. They're produced in small quantities, and if you were to try to scale it up, you wouldn't make money. But while plastic models are ostensibly cheaper to make, in practice they are often quite expensive to buy. And that is because, of course, the model itself is not the only thing that you're paying for when you buy something. You're, of course, paying for the designer. You're paying for the people who conceived of it. You're paying for the shareholders who are, expecting a dividend. And so when you balance it out, plastic models are cheap to make, but they are not necessarily cheaper to buy. And it is that situation which has sort of created the fertile ground into which the nascent 3D printing, I would say hobby, but it's more than just a hobby. It's a legitimate manufacturing technique. But that is the grounds that this new technology is disrupting, I guess. It's not really disruption, in my opinion, because what it's doing fundamentally is not something that's all that new. Like, yes, you can produce really cool stuff in a way that is a little bit different and a little bit easier, but anyone in the past could buy a metal model, cast it at home, and start spin casting their own copies. It's not that complicated. So while it is new, the main thing that it is relatively low effort. It's significantly easier to set up a 3D printer than it is to learn how to properly do silicone molds, to learn how to degas your silicone properly and get the technology to degas your silicone properly. To do the resin casting, you have to deal with, the downsides of working with resin, and to do metal casting, you have to deal with the downsides of working with metal. So it's, it's a new thing, but really it's just a much more approachable way of doing something that we always had the ability to do. And as a result, it has attracted a lot of people who don't like the business model of the big manufacturers. And I think that is okay, and that's a good thing. It's nice that there's an option for people who want to do stuff themselves. But it has created this sort of atmosphere where the people who are angling for 3D printing have an agenda, and the people who are against 3D printing have an agenda. And so you get this sort of fandom wars-esque kind of oversimplification, the Games Workshop versus 3D printing arguments often remind me of the sort of Mac, PC, iOS, Android, Xbox, PlayStation kind of disagreements. Because in many ways, people are talking past each other, not understanding what someone else's needs and motivations are. And so it adds to this sort of ongoing churn of conflict in our hobby. And so the reason I wanted to do this video is that I personally am someone who spends a ton of money on Games Workshop product every year, who buys a ton of plastic, and who has 3D printers and 3D prints, constantly when they're working. We'll get to more on that later. So I think I have a good perspective on this. I'm not beholden to GW. I'm not beholden to taking GW down. I personally think that Games Workshop provides some wonderful services that would be far better if the company was owned by their employees, not by an investor class. So personally, I think that, there's a lot of good to be found in both groups. And I think there's a lot of cool, fun stuff coming out of people who work in GW Plastics and out of people who 3D print. And I think that, okay, so I'm getting kind of sidetracked. I'm getting a little bit, I don't want to get too into this conflict, because that's really something to tackle, I think, after I've gone through and talked about the agony and the ecstasy of being a 3D printer. So let's take a moment and transition to the next segment, where we will be talking about the joy, the sublime joy of 3D printing. So, you just got your first 3D printer. You spent a bunch of time and energy setting it up and following all these rules in a book. It's probably an Ender 3 or Elgu Mars or any cubic photon, or one of the clones of those devices. And guess what? You are probably about to have a fantastic time, because starting out, getting set up, getting going with your 3D printer, it is rewarding as hell. So obviously, your first printer, you've never had a 3D printer before. So you're approaching it with new eyes. You are about to unwrap, a piece of technology in the mail. Always very dopamine rich activity. And you are going to plug it in, and you're going to level the bed, and you're going to find yourself with like a sheet of paper, and you're doing weird stuff and adjusting levers and knobs, and you're a little bit outside of your comfort zone, but you're trying. And you're going to probably be getting either a FDM printer, which is the kind that uses a spool of plastic that's fed through a hot end that melts the plastic and allows it to apply it to a build plate or build surface and build around and then go up and do the next layer, etc. Or it's going to be some variety of resin printer, whether it be SLA or DLP or what have you. Essentially, resin printers use a resin that cures from UV light, and they shine the UV light through a screen from underneath into a tank of resin. These two technologies each come with their own trade-offs and benefits. So PLA, the primary material people print their FDM machines with, is very affordable. It is extremely durable. It bounces well. It deals with impacts well. It's lightweight, and it is very practical for making scenery and terrain. And that's the primary use for those machines. Also props, another very common build with FDM printers is to make larger scale stuff, prop scale stuff. There are, of course, downsides to PLA. The detail of a nozzle-based printer is just never going to match that of a resin printer that is going through a high-definition screen, and you're going to have a much sort of it's a very slow process if you're doing a lot of area with the FDM printer. It has to manually draw every line, whereas the resin printer is printing each bit as a layer at the same time. So while resin prints can be slow, as long as you're not changing the height of the print, you can add as many models as fit on the build plate, and it will take the same amount of time. So it's a compromise, and you're going to notice that there are a lot of compromises in 3D printing. Another thing with resin is that the material is really kind of nasty. You need to work with a lot of protective equipment, and you don't really want to expose yourself to it. And the material in the end comes out as resin. So it's brittle. It's got a lot of downsides that you get with resins. The dust is toxic if you're sanding it or if you're drilling it or what have you. It's not, neither material is perfect for our purposes. If only there was a material that had the clarity and the detail of resin with the strength of PLA. If only, oh, right. It's called styrene. It exists, and it's what injection molds use. So when you get your first printer, you get it out of the box, you get that dopamine hit of unwrapping something, and then you get to stress out a little bit because you now have this machine that you need to learn how to use. And the process of learning your printer is usually quite rewarding. You're probably stepping out of your comfort zone. You might be trying new things, and you're going to learn how to level a print bed, no matter what kind of printer you have. And you're going to learn pretty quickly that there is a lot to this 3D printing stuff. Of course, you are going to need models to print. Your printer will come with a few models that are basically just there for you to have in case, you don't have any models planned out and you need to test if the printer works. You are not going to get, a Warhammer army on the SD card that comes with your 3D printer. So what the people starting out printing really experience is stepping into a whole new world, because there isn't just the printers themselves, but printers run off of files which tell them how to make models. And when you start looking for models, you discover that there are an endless variety. You've got multiple websites that host free STL files. You've got multiple websites that sell STL files. And you have countless Patreons where people subscribe and pay monthly and then receive a number of models in return. And this is absolutely thrilling. You know, you have this new piece of technology. You suddenly have a wealth of opportunity to try new things, to experiment. It's the best. This is the point where, you know, most people's relationship with their printer peaks. You know, you get your first few prints in, you find maybe a commercial STL that you really like and you want to start printing, or you find some free files that allow you to create some really cool stuff that you've been imagining, and you get going, you get raring. The printer goes burr, as they say, and it's divine. It is quite fun to make something yourself. So that aspect alone is very rewarding. I personally have always enjoyed creating things, and as you start to get into 3D printing as a hobby, very likely you'll start messing around with the STL files. You'll discover perhaps that you can slice and dice bits of models and attach them to each other or themselves. You can kit bash essentially digitally. You can kit bash something and see how it looks, and if it doesn't work, you can just stop. You can resize stuff. You can take something that would be small, you can make it big. It's a really fun, creative way to engage in our hobby. And so the 3D printer is rewarding. Personally, for me, the most engaging and fun part of 3D printing and how it has sort of changed the hobby for me is introducing me to this vast network of sculptors and designers who are making their own way, much in the way that the folks who started GW did. You know, these are artists, they're working artists, and I really value what they produce. So I like supporting people on Kickstarter, Patreon, buying their STL files from the various sites that sell them, because I think that their work is important and valuable. So I like to give them money for it. And of course, you know, I use free STLs too, because they're a great resource. And this is like opening up a whole new world, essentially. And it doesn't just stop at, you know, folks being able to make proxies for, you know, models from companies that make plastic models. It also allows people to recreate out of production stuff that hasn't been available for decades. Like, one common thing for people to 3D print is the Necromunda bulkheads from the Necromunda box set that came out in 1996. They haven't been for sale, I think, in probably 20, maybe more than 20 years. And they are a really lovely tool for making models. So people who don't want to go out and try to find secondhand, you know, versions of out of production models, because they understand how badly the secondary market warps those prices. But the important thing is that it's a extremely rewarding process to start out with your 3D printer. You know, you get your first few prints done and they look good, and you're sort of thinking about all the wealth of possibility that lies ahead of you. And that is, you know, that is the place that you find yourself in as the 3D printing hobbyist, that I think a lot of people post from that mindset. That's where their head is at. Even though when you are in the printing hobby, very quickly that stops being the dominant experience because you get used to that freedom. You become accustomed to the ability to make whatever you want. And so suddenly you're less thrilled by each of your new prints or what have you. And instead you find yourself dealing with feelings of frustration, dealing with the downsides of 3D printing. But I don't want to talk about the downsides of 3D printing yet. I am still interested in why it is such a major part of our hobby, why everyone sort of defaults to talking about it, and it is, of course, about money. Money, money, money. Printing is not inherently cheap. There are a lot of inputs that go into your 3D printer. You have to purchase the printer itself. You have to buy the material that it uses. You have to process what comes out of it. And you have to, deal with the time investment. But 3D printing for most people is going to amount to producing significantly cheaper models than if they had purchased them at retail price from the various companies that are, active in the marketplace. So the 3D printer allows you to do things that you probably couldn't afford before. So for example, I have some Necromunda tiles that are absolute beasts. We're talking 10-inch walls. If I had to purchase Games Workshop's walls in order to make all of those kits or all those tiles, I probably would have maybe done a third as many, maybe. It's absurd to even think about because the cost of buying those bits in plastic instead of just printing Zone Mortalis walls, the difference is astounding. And yes, the quality is better. In a couple of different ways, it is better. But for the purposes of a piece of terrain, those benefits, they really don't outweigh the cost, which is $1 cost. So the 3D printer allows you to do things which you couldn't previously do because of budgetary limitations. It also lets you do stuff that you couldn't necessarily do because it allows creators to make models of a type that you wouldn't necessarily see in stores. For example, one of my absolute favorite builds of this year is one of the first things I made, which I actually started printing it last year. It just took forever. It's a 2-foot long dirigible airship that I made into a Caradron Overlord, sort of true scale ironclad or what have you. And this model is so impractically large that I would be mad if a company tried to sell this other than as something that you can print at home, because it's almost absurd to even think about. It's that big. The box that such a thing would need to come in would be absurd. So I really like that aspect of 3D printing. It lets you do stuff. It lets you make things that otherwise almost certainly would not have been made. So big plus in 3D printing's corner there. Another thing is that it's a really liberating experience to be able to, have more control over what you're creating. It's really fun to be able to, instead of choosing from a small number of third-party manufacturers, you have access to hundreds of people who are all learning the sculpting arts and trying to, make a little bit of bucks off of that in the process. It's a really lovely community. The people that you meet who are these designers, they're fantastic. The people who are, the hobbyists who are enjoying those things are often quite fun. The important thing to understand is that 3D printing opens up a whole new world to you of opportunities. It allows you to make things bigger and more intense and more personalized. And that aspect of it is incredibly gratifying. It's hard to even summarize. It's something I didn't know that I needed until I had it. And that's also one of the downsides, which is that once you become accustomed to 3D printing, it becomes part of your life. And you really can't imagine life without your 3D printer, which means you're a little bit being held hostage by this hostile piece of technology that owes you no loyalty, but which you need. So with that, I guess we should probably talk about the downsides of 3D printing. Tell me the name of God, you mechanical son of a bitch.
You have become addicted to my creations. Even if you were to kill me, you could not go without me. You would merely buy another. You cannot kill me in any way that matters.
I'm not fucking scared of you. So, you have your first 3D printer. You've been printing for a while. Suddenly, gasp, something goes wrong. And we're not just talking about your run-of-the-mill spiderweb incident where, a support failed or something fell down. And so it, continued printing into the air. And there's just like this well of, woven spiderweb of plastic that was never added because the piece is gone. And that is a minor hiccup compared to the sort of problems that I'm talking about, which is more in the line of something shorting, your hot end getting clogged, having to need to replace your PTFE Bowden tube or what have you. There are a lot of ways that 3D printing can turn ugly, and it's so common that pretty much every 3D printing enthusiast I know would complain to you for hours if given the opportunity about the frustrations of dealing with their printer. And that is a really weird dichotomy, because on the one hand you have this machine that is granting people new freedoms and it's extremely affordable to make things with it, and on the other hand that piece of machinery is often going to break. It's going to break about as often as the McDonald's ice cream machine. So you're going to be spending a lot of time on Google asking Google what the hell you're supposed to do with this broken 3D printer. And guess what? You're going to find a ton of answers because the community is very helpful. So I definitely recommend using social media, using a search engine to find your specific brand of printer and figure out what's wrong with it so that you try to fix it. But the situation is inherently kind of frustrating for the person who is dealing with the device. I have often heard it said that 3D printing is a hobby unto itself, and I've heard people remark that you should really only get into 3D printing if you are interested in picking up a whole new hobby. There's probably a few other ways people phrase this concept, but so 3D printers are machines, and like any machine, they require maintenance. And so throughout the course of running your machine, you're going to do a number of things that will require you to, have technical, at least confidence in dealing with technical stuff. So oftentimes that can be as simple as changing out the screen in a resin printer, which is a very straightforward process, but which I've noticed from having done it a few times is fraught, because while you are dealing with this device, any little mistake can damage the ribbon cable that connects your screen to your device, and you can be out a $40 or $50 screen like that. And there is a lot of even more complex parts inside of a FDM machine. The opening for this video was me performing maintenance on both of these instruments, and I wanted to make it because I feel like a lot of the interactions I've had when talking about 3D printing, this sort of aspect of it doesn't even come up. But 3D printing requires constant, ongoing maintenance, and you're going to be doing it pretty much every time you print. Not necessarily every step, but you're going to be doing things to make sure that your printer stays running, and it's going to occupy your thoughts and your time. So that is, something that you have to think about. It's also complicated to get STL files that are, not, shall we say, stealing anyone else's art. And it's complicated about how you even define that and what parameters you put on that. A lot of artists are resculpting their takes on existing companies' IP. And when it's transformative, that's often allowed. But if it's not, then you're going to wind up getting in trouble. But probably you're just going to get a takedown notice or something. Because while companies are defensive of their copyrights on their sculpts, they are also reticent to engage and potentially lose in court on a claim that they think that they are entitled to. So there is a sort of cat and mouse game between Games Workshop and between the sculptors, where people will sculpt a little bit too close to GW's designs, and GW will come after them, and they go back and forth, and it's a whole thing, and it adds to the sort of heightened tension between these two different, sort of, I'm not even gonna say sects, because I feel like most people who own a 3D printer in the wargaming hobby are still purchasing models. They're not 3D printing everything, and that's certainly the case for me, and I think that there's pretty solid evidence that that's the case for most people. But it gets kind of worse because STL files are not like a model that's made of metal that you purchased and then cast your own and then started making copies. You can get an STL file from another person over email or even, Facebook Messenger or what have you. And it is instantly, what the fuck was I thinking? The fuck was I talking about? I think that I'm a little bit too tired to finish this video, but I really wanted to do the whole thing. I didn't even talk about the editing. This is going to be a nightmare to edit because I'm not working off of a script. I should have scripted. I wanted to script. I was like, no, just do it on the fly. We'll do it live. And look at this fucking mess that I've made. All right. So while creators are suddenly opened up to whole new markets of people, and there is a sort of gold rush of folks looking to, engage and sell their models to this community. There is unfortunately also piracy of small creators, designs. And when you do that, it's not like pirating something from a big company, where when you pirate something that's made by a designer who's working on contract for a large corporation, that person was paid for their labor. They were probably underpaid for their labor based off of, just the way corporate economics work. And then you have all of the sort of steps along the way where the product is made. With someone, copying or pirating or whatever, the person who made the model has already been paid for that effort. They're not, sort of depending on sales in order to get their paycheck. But when you have someone who is, a creator who happens to be selling models, often those models are, how they pay their bills and the difference between them being able to afford dinner or not. So it worries me when folks get into 3D printing expecting it to all be kind of a no man's land of free stuff. And they get surprised and they get mad about it, and they ask to get STLs off of people in order to make their stuff. They're essentially engaging in stealing, not necessarily in a literal sense, but taking the design, the product of the labor of someone who is, often underpaid, and then they just run with it and they pirate it. And there's a lot of downsides to that because there's a lot of creators out there, a huge number of creators. It's almost dizzying how many there are, but they're not all going to make it. So piracy and crowding out have potential downsides for the community as a whole, but those are, manageable things that any industry has to work through. And I think that our community values people's art enough to pay for it, I think, on the whole. So I hope that everyone out there who is using STL files that are, commercial STL files is paying for them, because do the decent thing. These people they're working folks. Treat them with respect. The same respect you expect to be treated with. In that same vein, when we talk about 3D printing and we talk about how it's cheaper, one of the things that often gets sidestepped or ignored is the topic of the value of your time. So while a 3D printer is a great way to make models, there is ongoing maintenance that you have to account for when you start to think about your costs. Now, not everyone values their time the same way, but I like to think of my time in monetary terms, in like billing cycles. And my leisure time, I value at an arbitrary number. It's not actually arbitrary, but it's based off of what it would take, the dollar cost it would take for me to give that time up to a company. So if I was to take on a contract in my spare time, what would I charge? And so for me, I value my time my free time at about $40 an hour, which is high, but not unreasonable when you think about what the cost of benefits are and all of that. So, when you think about your salary, you have to also think about how much your employer is contributing to your healthcare costs and all that stuff. When you figure out your actual hourly rate, because when you're a contractor, when you're taking that that kind of gig work, you don't get any of those benefits. So you have to, you want to include that difference and that overage. So that's why the number winds up being that high. So $40 an hour at that price, you don't actually have to do that much maintenance on a printer for the cost to start to spiral. My Ender 3 was a $200 printer that probably cost me $2-3 grand in time. When you actually think about it, the amount of time I spent futzing with it and dealing with failed prints and taking it apart and replacing parts and dealing with the BL touch and all of the stuff that time and effort I put into it, it definitely, if I value my time, is not worth the low price tag of those entry-level printers. And so there is this sort of phenomena of people buying an entry-level printer and then suddenly being overwhelmed by the amount of time they have to spend tweaking and dealing with it. And that is why, when asked about printers across the board, I tell people, spend up the extra money. Get the Prusa, the Prusa Mini if you're looking for a starter printer. Don't get an Ender 3. Don't get, Ender 5. Like, get the Prusa because it's a better printer and it's going to be significantly lower maintenance. And your mileage may vary. I know people who have like whole racks of Ender 3s, and for them that difference in price is not, it's not worth it. But for me, with my time, I can't justify spending the amount of time it took to get my Ender 3, to coax my Ender 3 into printing. I say that, but I still have it mothballed in the back room. And at some point, right, I'm probably going to get it running again, just so I have the 2, right? I mean, why not? And then we're sort of back at square one where I'm going to be dealing with troubleshooting an Ender 3 again. So we'll see. But for me, I got frustrated enough with the Ender 3 and its constant problems that I was willing to drop the $800 that it cost to buy the Prusa Mark III or i3. It's the i3 Mark 3.5 Plus, I think. And it's a really expensive printer, and that was the unassembled cost. The like fully assembled version is $1,000, and it's a lot of money to invest. It's not a low cost device the way that it sort of gets presented when you're being pitched the Ender 3, because if you don't want to spend constant frustrating time maintaining your device, you need to spend up. And the Prusa is the closest thing to a plug and play printer really that you can find for an FDM machine. I mean, it is rock solid. It doesn't have nearly as many problems as the Ender series and all of those, but mine was still down for like 2 months because of a really, really rough clog where I had to like replace a piece of internal tubing in the hot end, and getting the right bit cut to the right size and the precise like drilling on the PTFE is all like extremely crucial as outlined by the Prusa website. And so I had to order this, and it slowed me the hell down in fixing the device. So, there are downsides to using the more expensive device. You wind up needing the precision parts, and if you don't do it that way, then you'll degrade, the effectiveness of your printer. And that's not even getting into the next part, which is the ugly stuff. So 3D printing, it's this fantastic addition to the hobby. It's also a massive pain in the ass, and you're going to find yourself fighting with your device in all kinds of different fun and exciting ways. Just tonight, I had a nightmare of a time trying to chisel resin off of my flexible spring steel build plate on my my Elgumars 2. And it's a piece that's designed to allow me to get resin off, and it was like I literally had to get a knife out, like a box cutter, to get underneath the resin in order to get it off the build plate. Even with flexing it and everything, it was a nightmare. It took probably an hour of time to get the thing completely cleared off, which is crazy. That's the kind of stuff that you deal with on a regular basis with your printer. Print failures are always fun, where it's just like, what is going wrong with this? And dealing with supports with your resin printers can be an absolute headache. And these are all, just run-of-the-mill problems. But the ugly side of 3D printing has a few other, issues. So one, obviously, there is, the fumes. And it's a weird topic to even delve into, because what most 3D printing, manufacturers will tell you about their fumes is to ventilate as much as possible, because they don't know what the effects of their fumes are. There are very few 3D, so if you're talking about resin printers, there are very few resin manufacturers that publish the recipe that goes into their resin. So we don't even know what chemicals are reacting in our tank when it's curing our resins. And they treat it as trade secrets. It's not them being nefarious. They're trying to protect their intellectual property or whatever. But don't get me started on intellectual property. We'll be here all night. So without those sheets, it's hard to know exactly what chemicals are going into the mix. But we have some broad ideas, because there's only so many chemicals that work in this setting. And the problem is that even what we know, which is that they produce a lot of volatile organic compounds, we don't know what the actual specific long-term effects of exposure are, other than these sort of broad strokes of VOCs. So stuff like sinus irritation and asthma, that kind of stuff are, irritated by those fumes. So that is known, but we don't really know anything about the long-term effects of these compounds. And that's a little bit scary, because we don't want to be causing ourselves long-term health effects. So obviously, when you're doing printing, best practices are to do it in a well-ventilated area, to do it in a setting where you have good filtration and you have a good seal on your print enclosure, and you can mitigate a lot of the downsides with good filters and good seals, but you are going to have some fumes. So ventilating is the best bet. And then we don't even really think about it, but PLA, when heated, you have a very similar issue. It smokes, it burns, it produces volatile organic compounds. And if you are running multiple printers in a space, it's almost certainly going to exceed the OSHA limitations for a workplace VOC limit. One printer running, you're not in as big of a downside in that situation, but it's a risk, and it's something that we don't necessarily think about, and it's important to be mindful of potential health effects. So that means that it limits who can actually participate in this hobby, because you need to have dedicated space where your printer can be. It's in a ventilated area that is safe, that is climate controlled, and that means that for a lot of people that you're trying to pitch your roommates or your significant other or whoever on the idea of a 3D printer being in the living room, because where else you could put it? Maybe if you have an office upstairs, you get lucky, but it's a limiting factor. And so as a result, I think a lot of people are doing riskier things that my printer is not in a well ventilated area per se. But I do have filters and stuff on it, and I haven't had any irritation or issues from the the output. But also, I'm not, generally speaking, down here when it's running. I have air filters that are running, in the basement itself. So, it's kind of I don't want to advocate for doing what I'm doing. That's basically where I am nervous about the rapid proliferation of this technology without us having a solid understanding of what the health effects of the fumes could be. So, that makes me nervous, and that adds to kind of my apprehension for the way people talk about 3D printing as a hobby. People are way too evangelical about it without considering the downsides, without considering what you need to actually make your setup work and make it work safely. And while we're talking about safety, resin printing has a whole host of safety issues coming from the fact that resins are nasty substances. They can burn your skin, they can damage your eyesight, they can poison you. They're not a substance to be treated lightly. If you're working with resin, you should be wearing eye protection, hand protection. Ideally, you would have, a smock or something protecting you from spillage, because nobody's perfect 100% of the time. Stuff spills, stuff gets tipped over. And if you get resin on your skin, it can cause significant damage. There, of course, are, different types of resin, and, your skin, it depends on the type of contact. It depends on how long the contact is for. It depends on how you handle, getting it off of your body or whatever. But it can cause permanent damage if you don't clean up effectively and make sure that you're not having that uncured resin in contact with your body. One time, I had a tiny bit of resin sort of drip onto my finger as I was taking a model that I literally had just used like a little pipette to put a small amount of resin into a base in order to make a water effect. And I spilled just a drop of it on my hand, my ungloved hand, because I wasn't wearing gloves, because I was being careless. I was thinking, oh, the resin is already laid. Like, I just move it outside now for the sun to cure it. And I walked outside to the UV blast furnace that is our sun, and immediately felt the scorching heat of the resin curing on my finger, and sprinted inside to try to get that nasty substance off of me. And yeah, so that's the stuff that you're working with. It can't be around young kids. It's not a safe thing to have just sitting around. And then to top it off, most people are washing their resins in IPA, which, is 99% alcohol, extremely, fire hazard, dangerous, while also having noxious fumes. And that's just par for the course with this hobby. So I get reticent and nervous to recommend this hobby so evangelically. That's a lot to ask someone to take on in their home. And there are ways to mitigate it. Like, for example, for my printer, I use only water washable resin, which are resins that you don't need the IPA mixture to, or the IPA, solution. It's mostly pure IPA, to clean the uncured resin off of your model. And for me, that's a huge difference. It costs more to buy those resins, but I've also noticed they seem to have less harsh fumes, and I definitely prefer not having a giant tub of highly flammable, potentially explosive chemicals sitting in my basement. So, there are ways to mitigate it, But the sort of standard intro to 3D printing for most people is going to be via washing their models in IPA, and that kind of oogs me out. I mean, I'm not saying that you can't do that, but I don't want to recommend to people that they bring that substance into their homes, because what if something goes wrong? That then part of that damage that's done is on me for recommending it. You know what I'm saying? So it's hard to just say outright, you should definitely get a 3D printer. I think it's important to tell people about all of this. So talk about the safety measures that you have to engage in. Talk about the space needs. Talk about the noise. Because let me tell you, both kinds of printers make noise, but the FDM printers, even the Prusa, which is like a relatively quiet machine, I have to pause it to record. It's so loud I can't tape the show while it's on. It's not usually audible outside of the room, but it is quite noisy in here. And it takes up a decent amount of space. The stuff it makes takes up even more space, which is something that you start to run into when you have a 3D printer. You start to like run out of spots to stick prints, and you're suddenly wondering like, what am I going to do when I run out of places for me to squirrel away stuff that I've printed? Especially if you're one of those painting procrastinators. You're like, oh, I just have piles and piles and piles of gray stuff that are, orange or blue or rainbow or silver stuff that I have not yet painted. That's part of the world of 3D printing is hoarding prints or hoarding STLs, finding yourself collecting STL files that you may never print, participating in Patreons that you find yourself compelled to keep supporting the creators, even if you haven't printed anything from them in months and months and months. And so it's it's a mixed bag, and I don't like to shy away from addressing the realities of 3D printing. So, in the end, I think that 3D printing is a beneficial thing, but that you have to understand that you are taking on a lot in order to gain that sort of magical, creative, joyous process. And it takes maintenance. It has health implications. It's not the obvious, immediate, thing that everyone needs, the way that a lot of people will tell you in the community. And I think with that, we kind of have to go on to, unpacking all of this in a sort of conclusion sort of sense. So 3D printing is complicated. It's not a simple, one size fits all kind of thing. I can't say that it's bad. I think it's amazing. And I've done stuff that I'm really proud of with my printers. And at the same time, I can't recommend printing to everyone. And that is sort of the real thrust of why I'm talking about this to such a, extended degree. It's been a huge growth over the last 10 years and a lot of innovation in terms of improving quality. And those things are fantastic. But there is this sort of perception or, meme or what have you that people have that, the 3D printing is going to continue to become easier and easier to do. And it's not that simple, because when you're talking about, the world of FDM printing, it's never going to become faster while also maintaining the same level of detail. The problem with FDM printing is actually the basic chemical needs of the materials. You have to allow a certain amount of cooling, and if you want finer detail, anything even approaching the kind of detail that you get out of a resin printer, then you have to print even smaller and smaller lines. And guess what? When you combine the thermal properties of the material with the thin layer height, you are going to be hard limited by physics on how quickly you can produce that product. And so FDM printing will never be faster or more efficient than something like injection molding. Now, it can absolutely produce home models that are cheaper than the retail cost of other models. And that makes sense when you think about it, right? Because you're not having all that overhead that is involved in production and packaging and all of that stuff. So, of course, it's cheaper, but it's not ever going to become like faster to actually produce. So FDM printing is kind of limited by its technical limitations to what we have now. So really what we have in our future is FDM printers of the sort of Prusa quality becoming more affordable, because we have dirt cheap printers now. It's not user friendly in the way that people sort of talk about, needing to be in order to get that sea change where 3D printing becomes dominant, takes over. But I think that there's an even more fundamental problem, which is that people assume that other people want to, produce things themselves, or that, the value proposition will be such that people want to do that. But it's worth considering that the peace and quiet and lack of having maintenance costs and all of that is priced in to why you pay what you pay for a styrene model in a box with instructions, with the company behind it, a customer support line if something is wrong. There's a reason that you are getting all of that when you buy those models. And there is just the fact that styrene is a better material for models in that size than resin is, or than PLA even is, because of just the basic properties of those materials. And when you talk about the resin printer, you've got all of that hassle that comes with taking your print that you've made. You have to separate it from its supports, which can often be a bit of work, especially if the person who designed the STL was not super great at adding supports and has added supports that are going to partially break the model as you cut them off. Then you have to wash it, and then you have to cure it again, and then you got to let it sit. And it's just kind of a whole thing. And guess what? There's not going to be a revolution in the technology for resin printing that's going to mitigate those steps. So unless the average consumer becomes comfortable with, suiting up with eye protection and gloves in order to pour resin into a tank and print models and then have to scrub them and cure them, that isn't going away. That problem's not going to just fix itself. So I think that the predictions of 3D printers becoming part of everyone's home or what have you are wildly misunderstanding the needs and the capabilities of the average consumer, let alone the value the average consumer puts on convenience. And that's something that you really can't stress enough. I mean, when you look at a 250, 20-ounce bottle of soda at the store, it's probably 5 cents worth of, of stuff, and then, maybe like 15 cents worth of shipping and materials, and you pay $2.50 for it. And it's even worse when you go through a drive-through and they like charge you like $3.60 for a large soda, and you feel like you're getting a good deal because you're like, it's only like 50 cents more and you get twice as much. But the amount of material that goes into that is absolutely minimal, and the cost is incredibly low. So you're paying a huge markup for the convenience. People pay markups for convenience all the time. And I think about it a lot when I'm at the bar and I'm paying, $10, $12, $15 for a cocktail. It's like, I can make that cocktail myself. But that's not why you go to the bar. You don't go to the bar to have the cocktail that you could make at home. You go to the bar for the setting, for the ambiance, for the company, for the fact that somebody else is making your drinks, for the fact that they've got like 5 different random, high-end liquors that you've never had before, and you can try it for, a relatively low cost instead of having to spend $70 on various bottles in order to get the ingredients to make the drink that you like. So convenience has a dollar value to people, and fundamentally 3D printing is not convenient. It is the opposite of convenience. It's, it's obligation, and it makes wonderful things. And I couldn't be happier with my, experience of 3D printing, and I wouldn't change anything about it. But I want people to be aware that when someone is telling you about how amazing and game-changing 3D printing is, that the best 3D printer, the best 3D printer that you can have is your friends. Because 3D printing as a hobbyist it's not a universally fun experience. In fact, I would go so far as to say that more total time of my experience 3D printing is negative than positive. So it's not something I would necessarily recommend to other people, but it's something that I also engage in and show and talk about a lot. So it's kind of this weird, almost dissonance, not quite, because this is, there's a difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, right? I don't 3D print for intrinsic reasons. I don't need to run a 3D printer. If I ran out of modeling projects, my printers would be offline immediately. I'm not looking for things to print, right? I am a hobbyist who makes things for certain games, who wants to create little worlds. And the 3D printers allow me to do that to a much higher degree than just buying commercial kits. But the downside is that I have to deal with the maintenance, the running sunk costs of these printers. So I guess what I'm saying is 3D printing is a really compelling experience if you are willing to give yourself over to it. But you should ask yourself a lot of questions about whether it's worth that. Because just looking at the sort of dollar cost of a printer and the dollar cost of a kilogram of resin and the experience of dealing with all of this stuff, I want you to think about your needs and whether it really is worth what it's going to take to maintain these things. Because there's very likely a makerspace nearby you that has a 3D printer that you can rent time on, or a library, a public library that you can rent time on. And it's more expensive that way. You have, a cost that you're paying per gram of material or what have you. And it's probably a significant markup over having a machine yourself. But you have to consider that what you're paying for is someone who has to deal with all that hassle that I was just talking about, and them doing it for you. So, worth considering. 3D printing is an excellent component of the future of our hobby, but it isn't poised to be this universal thing the way a lot of people seem to think it is. And more importantly, I think it's probably not ever going to be a replacement for injection molded plastics, just based off of the fact that the injection molded plastics are actually cheaper to make and faster. It's just the markup. So if it really has to compete, the plastics, I think, will generally speaking win out if they actually see themselves in competition with the resin, with the printing resins. But I actually think in a lot of cases they won't even see themselves as being in competition, which I think is where Games Workshop is right now. They're not really, dealing with 3D printing as a threat, because they're having trouble meeting the demand for the total amount of product that they sell. They have limited capacity to produce stuff at their factory, and they struggle to keep up with it. So Games Workshop, it doesn't seem to be sweating the the impact of 3D printing right now. And I don't think that, as a lot of people sort of seem to predict, that things will become dire for GW in the very near future. But I think they neglect to understand that for most people, the convenience of being able to walk into the shop and buy a box of models are going to outweigh the dollar cost that they're paying. And certainly dedicating such a large portion of their life to a 3D printer is wildly unrealistic and unhelpful. So unless you are like a fully bought-in whale, you are probably not the target for that sort of 3D printer replacement kind of stuff. And even if you are, there's a strong chance that as new kits come out that catch your eye, you will still wind up collecting them anyway. And I say that without any judgment and with full love, because of course I am also that exact same person. So why on earth would I judge you? As I have a kill team box on the way without having built any of the infantry from my last 2 kill team boxes. So, I'm one of you. I know your tricks. I know your deal. 3D printers are great, and I love 3D printing, but it's not going to take over. It's not going to radically change the marketplace. If anything, I feel like what it's going to do is make it a lot easier for folks to customize things and do silly stuff with it. And I think it will be very common for one or a few members of a community to have a printer and for other people to sort of print stuff on it, because fundamentally, running your printer all the time costs money. And not everyone is going to be able to afford to be running their printer 24/7, but you might have a friend who is interested in running your printer 12/12, and you might be able to work out an arrangement or whatever, or you go to the library or what have you. So it's in the end, 3D printing is a serious addition to the hobby, but I don't think it fundamentally changes the game. And I don't think that Games Workshop is scared of it. Even if you get into the point where 3D printing is impacting Games Workshop sales, as unlikely as I kind of perceive that to be, you still have the situation where the plastic manufacturers can drop their prices. But resins for printing are expensive. And, you do the math. They can compete if they have to, but that's only if they perceive the printers is taking part of their market away. And some companies are even adapting the 3D printers and selling STL files, and I think that's really cool. I really like that Anvil Industry, for example, sells STL files. I used to sometimes order their bits, but now you can buy a print or buy an STL file, and you don't have to deal with shipping from England. It's nice. And like the company that makes the Fallout tabletop game, they have a bunch of STL files for sale. There's a lot of stuff out there, potential for innovation and new stuff and new ideas and all of that in the 3D printing space that I think is fantastic. So I want to, to be clear that I'm absolutely pro 3D printing in all senses of the word. I just also am a realist about what 3D printing is like as an experience as a user, and why I think people should be skeptical going into something that they're being sold as, this amazing, unstoppably fun kind of experience, when the reality is not necessarily so glamorous. So I think that pretty much covers everything I wanted to talk about. I probably could have put this together a little more coherently if I had fully scripted this out, but I was really trying to not do the thing where I overly script the video. So hopefully this all made sense. I hope that even the people who are predisposed to have a negative reaction to any sort of mild criticism of 3D printing, and the GW fanboys who don't like 3D printing at all, can find something in this that they would, share with a friend or whatever. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe my video to get more like it. I really have been enjoying making YouTube content. I'm trucking away towards 1,000 subscribers, and then, who knows from there. So tell your friends about the show, and pass it around, and let me know if there's any topics you want me to cover, because I've got a lot of ideas, but I'm slowly working my way through stuff. And so 3D printing in a nutshell, it's funstrating. It's great annoying. It's double plus good bad. Thanks to my patrons for keeping my show afloat. And of course, you too can become a patron for as little as $2 a month by going over to patreon.com/domerunners. And of course, don't forget to check out the podcast, domerunners.buzzsprout.com, where I have endless amounts of Necromunda content. And of course, everybody stay safe, and don't forget to change your paint water.